Colleagues and comrades, light some candles, put on your finest Barry White record, and crack open a bottle of decent mid-shelf red, because today we are going to do Sexy Deleuze, what I'm calling a materialist approach to sex and relationships, and we are overjoyed, there we go, that's another thing for the edit, isn't it? To be joined by Justin Hancock, who's the coordinator and head trainer over at BISH Training, co-author of Enjoy Sex, How, When, and If You Want To, a practical and inclusive guide with Meg John Barker, and of course the author of Can We Talk About Consent, who also hosts the Culture, Sex, and Relationships podcast. And we brought him on because we want to talk about the ways in which things like assemblage theory, affect theory, new materialisms, Foucault, and the work of Deleuze and Guattari can feed into how we talk about sort of concepts or processes of relationships and sexuality today. Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really thrilled to be on, and I'm a fan of the show. So I've never clicked a yes, I want to do this so hard in my life. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. So just if people get an introduction to your work, can you just explain what it is you do in terms of the training courses you provide, as well as your wider research into this topic, and sort of how, maybe how you got into working with these particular kind of post-structuralist theories within this field? What came first in a way? Was it the post-structuralist theories, or was it the application first and foremost?
Yeah, it's definitely the other way around. So everything that I kind of do is all just kind of me. So I'm completely freelance relationships and sex educator. And I got into it in 1999. So I'll at some point be celebrating/commiserating my 25-year anniversary later in the year, probably. I'll just go to the pub and I'll do that anyway. And I got into it through youth work, basically. So my training is in very practical, working with needs of young people. Youth work was a thing where back in the day where every city in the UK and most towns would have a statutory youth service, so where they would train youth workers to run youth projects and youth centres with young people who were both in and out of school, stuff to do in the evening and recreational, educational activities. We don't have that so much anymore because of the cuts. So that's how I got into it, and that's kind of my main training. And then I've been working in sexual health clinics, but also doing kind of advice work in sexual health clinics, but also doing relationships and sex ed in person as well, which I still do. And I do training courses for anyone doing this kind of work, so teachers, youth workers, social workers, that kind of thing. And I started my website, BISH, which is a website for, well, it's technically for everyone over the age of 14, but it's kind of my project for young people, which is the thing I'm most known for, I guess, which is bishuk.com. And it's one of the leading English language sex ed resources. Like another really great one is scarletine.com, an American one. And then started doing the Meg John and Justin podcast, which turned into Culture, Sex, Relationships. But basically, over the last few years, and this certainly accelerated through lockdown and discovering podcasts like yours, I began just becoming much more interested in theory. And so I've kind of been like undertaking I suppose, like a theory backfilling of a lot of the work that I do and trying to really kind of ground it. Because a lot of the work that I do is kind of pretty unique, but only because there's not a great deal else out there. And so we are in kind of like, I guess, like nomadic war machine kind of territory, dropping my first Deleuze and Guattari reference on a podcast that isn't mine. And so I kind of felt like I needed a new set of tools, a way to kind of give me a bit of confidence in how in that I feel like I'm doing a good job, but to find some it's find like a home really for kind of like a theoretical home for the work that I want to do, I suppose. I can't really make any more sense than that, really. And I'm now doing a PhD about BISH. And so really as part of that, I'm making a case for why a materialist approach to relationships and sexuality education is the way forward and why materialist advice is the best. I don't have the answer to that yet, but that's part of what I'm going to find. It's part of the research. If you have any ideas, please, I'm here to learn. But that's what I've been up to, basically, for the last 25 years.
No, fantastic. I mean, not that we have to answer the question of why materialist sex ed is the best, of the fact that materialism is just the best philosophy. But thinking about sort of what's inadequate with typical ways we consider sexuality, sexual relations, and relationships generally, I mean, what does materialism, you think, bring to the table which other theories don't? Because, I mean, the origins of materialism as we know it, comes from people like Karl Marx, and try to think things in terms of social relations rather than as individual atomized people that may possess things like private property and indeed possess other people, as we have in sort of the old feudal marriage relation, or even to some extent how we may think of some kinds of monogamy, and then of course, we have the new materialisms, which arise from what we might call process philosophy. So it seems, I mean, from what I've got from listening to your show, and of course, we're going to link everything down below in the description, is that your approach tends to focus on one sort of thinking about processes, thinking about relations, removing these sort of atomized barriers that keep individuals within themselves, and thinking about more in terms of connection than possession. Could we sort of unpack some of that, if that's an accurate way of describing what you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do, really. So my work's always been kind of interested in what things do, but also how we might do things. So, even from when I started writing the website BISH, I was never kind of talking about, kind of real love and kind of idealized versions of what love is and what love should feel like. And actually, it's more this kind of, I suppose, the nearest reference point to what I've been talking about here is bell hooks and all about love, and just the idea that love is a kind of a set of like daily microprocessors of the possibilities of having joy with other people. And so I think that's kind of one of my kind of key touchstones really is, well, how might we do this and what does this do, rather than it just being this kind of thing that we might have or not have. But also, I think in terms for things like sex, I think it's just really useful. It kind of goes beyond this, just me having like a kind of a political commitment to materialism. It's more that, well, I think it's just easier and it takes the pressure off us if we don't think of ourselves as individuated, arboreal, singular individuals trying to, for example, impress another single individual, arboreal individual, instead to notice how things emerge between people. And so ideas of like emergence and flow and what else, and this happens and then this happened and then this happened, things actually happening in relation to each other. I also just think speaks to a more honest account of how we get into relationships, how we do sexuality, how we actually do our relationship with ourselves. And I just genuinely feel that that's kind of just how it works. And so when a lot of people in relationships to people not in relationships think very basic, straightforward things like, oh, just be yourself, or don't think about it too much, or, they're actually not really fully reflecting on the actual materialist perspective of how things just emerged with another person in concert and in relation. And I think that's just... I think that's just helpful because it means that it means sometimes. So, for example, in my advice about how to get a girlfriend, boyfriend, or then friend, or also my advice about how to make friends, which I've written about recently at BISH, I'm really talking about kind of, well, put yourself in the spaces where you might emerge with somebody else and pay really close attention to what that might look like. And so I guess I'm encouraging people to draw lines of flight there, which we can talk about in a bit. But I just think that really that kind of idea of emergence and in relation is a more honest account of how we actually do it and how we are at our happiest in sex and relationships and in our relationship with ourselves. And also, I think it's just more helpful. It takes the pressure off us, and I think it makes life a bit easier and more joyful.
Let's get a technical term down then, because one of the best things about your approach, Justin, is that you subtract what Deleuze and Guattari would call the overcoding. For listeners, for Deleuze and Guattari, the thing that unifies a selection of things that we think of as unity, for example, like a nation, or even indeed a relationship like a marriage, that's not like an emergent thing, but it's an additional part alongside a series of parts. And one of the things I like about your approach, Justin, in the podcast, your writings, is that you subtract one of the overcodings of the concept that we know as sex. And let's get into the concept of sex and the sexual relationship itself, because one of the things that, for example, if comrades, and of course you're going to go listen to this podcast after the show, of course, and one of the phrases you're going to hear a lot is PIV. Different kinds of sex as a relation between possibly oneself and with others. And well, a lot of your work seems to subtract the, let's say, the bourgeois dimension of sex, a kind of unity of atomistic individuals. Can we get into what sex means in terms of how it functions in your work? Because a lot of people will be thinking of it as, to put it in your terms, so PIV followed by orgasm, which is conflated with ejaculation, and that's kind of it from a masculine sort of cis heteropatriarchal perspective. How do we unpack that and explode that with the kind of multiplicity angle here?
Well, crucially, you left out the word plateau in your explanation of the human sexual response cycle. But anyway, so basically it's kind of, I guess I'm reframing, I suppose, one of the theoretical ideas I started using before I found kind of effects and assemblage theory, before I actually understood it. Like, first of all, one of the reasons that I've, just to also say, some of the really cutting edge work in sex and relationships education and research is using kind of post-humanism, and I didn't understand a word of it when I was trying to read it. And so using podcasts like yours and Jeremy Gilbert's Cultural Power Politics podcast as well helped me kind of do that backfilling. So thank you for you to do that work to help me to read these things. Before that, I was really interested in basically what we would call kind of critical sexology, and this comes from I think it's Ken Plummer, who wrote an essay about it. Trying to cite things on my head, but I guess it's a podcast, so we don't have to cite everything, do we? But it's I think it's called critical sexology or something like that. And basically it's about how ideas of sex are produced. And I suppose it's like Foucauldian as well. And so really the thing that I would constantly I'm constantly talking about is to try to see sex as as hundreds, thousands of different kinds of sexual activities that can be done in many, many different ways that we may or may not choose to enter into with somebody else. And that's what sex could be. They are the possibilities for sex. And it's a more consensual way of doing sex. It's maximizing our freedoms to choose, which is both more consensual in the legal sense of the word, but it's also Spinozan in the augmenting our body's capacity to act, and the Brian Masumi definition of that from Thousand Plateaus. So whenever I talk about sex on the show or at my website BISH, I'm talking about there being the possibility of lots of different sexual activities, but that we've got this incredibly strong set of codes for how it is that we're meant to do sex, which are strongly disciplined by the state and community and each other and intrapsychically as well, that if we're not doing sex in the normative way, so getting an erection, putting it inside somebody, and then experiencing, the human sexual response cycle by Masters and Johnson, which isn't very useful, then if we're not doing that, then we're not doing it properly. There's an it that we're not doing properly, and that really a lot of sex educators, a lot of sex influencers, a lot of things that give sex educators a bad name are really people trying to teach you how to do very scripted, heteronormative form of sexual activity better. And I think that really the much more radical, to me, approach is to say, pick a couple of things from the massive menu of sex that is available, see how you get on, notice what happens between you, chat about it afterwards, and then see what happens next time. That's, I think that's a much more helpful way of approaching sex. And I think it's probably more material as well, because it's kind of paying attention to things like noises and vibe and how we're affecting each other. And if we're feeling unconscious, is the room too light? Have you got some music on in the background? Because, if you're a young person, you don't have your own place, how do you muffle possible sounds? How do you respond to each other's sounds? How do you respond to how our bodies might twitch or relax or straighten or become emboldened or become in some ways orgasmic? Yeah, so that's the kind of way I frame sex. God, that was a long answer. I'm really sorry.
No, you're doing fantastic, man. And Justin, thank you for coming on the show. This is a fascinating topic for so many reasons. There's so many things that I want to get to, too. I want to talk about making friends, but I think I want to set that towards the end of the discussion. Just to revisit something quickly that Adam had talked about, I think one of the predominant ideas in Deleuze and Guattari's work that was on my mind coming into this discussion, Adam already put on the table, which is the difference between the transcendent and the immanent sphere, particularly, and just to put this conversation on the ground, I'm imagining somebody's looking at this discussion on YouTube. They're seeing this thumbnail and it says sexy Deleuze. And they're like, I haven't read Deleuze, but now's the time. So I'm going to keep it 4 on the floor for everybody here and just try to keep it as easy to access as possible. I think in very simple terms, when we think about cis heteronormative marriage relationships. Perhaps this doesn't even just apply to cis heteronormative marriages, all kinds of relationships, how a particular ideal, a transcendent ideal, elevates itself above the conditions of the relationship. I think this is really what a lot of people, I mean, even myself, not even just in like my marriage, but my friendships and my relationships with people I work with or whomever, how this sort of, I almost see it sometimes as a Christian ideal since I was raised Catholic, but it's interesting to see that, somebody who's worked on Deleuze and cleaves to the ideas of Deleuze and Guattari, that still there are ways in which this sort of transcendent, moralized notion of what a good relationship looks like, a good marriage looks like, a healthy sexual life looks like, kind of weasels its way in. Even today in the car, just talking with my wife, just having a good time talking about just stuff. And I said to her, I'm like, the way that we think about this collectively, like we're not Christians, but we're thinking about this in a very sort of traditional Catholic manner. And those were the households that we grew up within. It just seems so difficult sometimes in the context of a relationship, the way that we oblige ourselves to other, the way that we rehearse that obligation and so forth. Even if in sort of discrete manifest terms, we're trying to avoid that, it always kind of comes back in. And I don't know where to begin with this without sounding like I'm asking you for personal advice, but maybe the best way to ask it is like, in any given relationship where there is this sort of ideal of what, like what the picture of the relationship should look like, what are some things that you see from time to time in relationships that has been a prompt for you to give a particular kind of advice? Like, what is something that comes up time and again when it comes to dealing with people who are in long-term relationships and want to manage it, but you detect, for example, that there is this picture of the relationship that's almost grown larger than the imminent sphere of the relationship itself? Where do you begin with that?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to use this to lead into my very oversimplified version of the three novellas, because I think this gets to the heart of how to give advice. So I think, to answer your question directly, I think often what happens is that with a lot of the questions that I get, it's that people are taking this kind of a template or a pattern, I hesitate to say a refrain or a riff of how you're supposed to do relationships, I guess. I suppose really what we're talking about there is, I suppose what we've learned from, I guess if you grew up in a Catholic household with Catholic schooling and your parents did the same, and these things get kind of transferred on, I guess, through, I've not read enough about this, but through things like mimetic identification, I guess. So, that would make sense of why it is that that's the relationship that you're doing. But there's nothing inherently wrong in any relationship, but the missing thing is always the intentionality of it. It's the who do we do it for? Like, people are often in relationships because it's like normal, or because of, I suppose, the big other, or the idea of, sorry to drop in a bit of, I suppose, non-materialist language there, but because everyone else is. And really, when we're taking away that kind of intentionality about it, we're depriving ourselves the possibility of a line of flight, aren't we? So I suppose to kind of talk about how I would give advice here, I'd say, well, I'd use the three lines in the three novellas. And the three lines, and I'm massively oversimplifying this, dear listener, but as far as I understand it, the three lines are as follows. So the first line is the what, where, how, what's happening line, our social location, the things that we're actually concretely doing, how we're read, what our day-to-day life appears to be, if we have any issues, what those issues are, or how we might describe the relationship. And the first line is how we might describe or identify the relationship, and all the things that are actually that we might appear on the surface, I suppose, of a rhizome. Line two are the kind of unspoken things, like the secret things, the affective results of things, the cracks appearing beneath us. I think as Deleuze and Guattari talk about, things that we know there's some things there, but we're not quite sure, but we know that if we keep doing this, line one, that we'll find it. Things that we haven't kind of figured out yet, things that our partner might be thinking, things that we might be thinking but haven't been brave enough to speak to them about. That's kind of line two. And so I guess what I encourage then is to think about, okay, well, what resources do you have already to help you pick up the pen and draw a line of flight around those two lines, to incorporate all those lines into an assemblage, into a rhizomatic assemblage, if that's not a tautology, in order to help them to figure out what's going on for them. So it's never to kind of give them another discourse, which would be kind of line one behavior, to say, well, what you should try doing if you've been doing monogamy and, you're planning on kids and doing something very kind of, like acceptable, you should try doing the unacceptable, try this, the inverted commas non-acceptable, try doing ethical non-monogamy or relationship anarchy or whatever we call these things. That's what a lot of other sex educators might try to do. But instead, what I would say is, well, I'm paying attention to your line one and your line two, the things you're saying to me about what's going on in your relationship, some of the things that you're hinting at, or the things that are unsaid, or the things that are where there is something going on. And here's the pen. What resources have you already got that that might help you to make sense of all of this in ways that feel good for you? And so I think that's one of my new kind of guiding principles. I suppose I've always tried to do that in advice work, but now I've got a nice theoretical framing for it. That's going to be really nice in my PhD to kind of draw on that. But I think that's the issue, really, is that at no point should anyone giving advice about relationships tell people how they should be doing it, but it's to help people to see what resources they have in order to become other, or in order to bring in the line of flight there is the possibility of them actually having some degree of agency as well, which is I think one of the crucial issues of that, which is...
Well, I have so many questions now, but I'm just going to pick the ones that come immediately to mind. When we think about lines of flight, we also think about the risks involved and how lines of flight often fail. And anything from a monogamous marriage to sort of experimenting with a particular sexual tendency, or just going to find out what you are or what you're becoming, perhaps, it engenders the risk of a relationship or an experiment failing. What, in your mind, is the Deleuzian approach or the Deleuze-Guattarian approach to dealing with the failure of either a relationship or of an experiment?
Well, would they use the word failure? I think what I might say is a change in relationship and a change in the relation to the relation. And certainly in the three novellas, Plateau, when they're talking about lines of flight, they're really wary of it's not jumping over the prison fence and making a break for it. It's one of the terms they use, or sailing to the South Seas to find mummy and daddy. It's important that line of flight goes back around lines 1 and 2 in order to help you make sense of what you have, because then if you do that, you're not paying attention to the resources you have, and all you see yourself as having are deficits. If you think that there are going to be some resources over here that you've hitherto not found, but you're sure that far away from the assemblage, if you head in that direction, I think what people might do if they're going to do something radical is that they might run away from where their assemblage is, kind of in the opposite direction, thinking, well, everything over here is shit. So if I go in the other direction, employing the Seinfeldian opposite, everything must be right. And I think that's often where people kind of go wrong. So, or if they're kind of just acting out of pocket or doing something that is completely not paying attention to their expertise and how they know how to be happy, I think is likely to kind of, I suppose, end badly. But again, I don't know, or go badly, I suppose.
Well, maybe one more thing. I kind of set you up a little bit there, because I understand too that, when we think about anti-Oedipus, they say that desiring machines are always breaking down, in a sense that any sort of established image that I have of a particular relationship is already coming to pass. I guess the question is, as we turn out of a situation, or maybe feel the impulse to move away, for example, or to try something new, does that not entail the risk in some particular relationships, perhaps confronting certain tensions or antagonisms head on, or kind of sticking with things a little bit? And this here's, of course, another setup. But if we are Deleuze-Guattarians, how do we avoid the risk of simply running away or finding a new line of flight when things get hot in a particular situation? Maybe there's some gold to be found if we drill down alchemically inside our relationship and then find that, if we would have explored these tensions versus perhaps running away or trying something new, then we would have found something enlivening.
Well, I'm going to throw in another theorist just to really confuse everyone. But the other thing I've been trained in recently is solution-focused brief therapy. which is an incredibly interesting therapeutic model, which is brief. So it can work after 1 or 2 sessions, and it pays very little attention to the problem. And it's all about kind of finding resources and solutions. And one of the key questions in it is what else? What difference would that make? What else? What does that do? How would they respond? How will you respond to that? And we kind of ask those questions after the magic question. So the magic question is, imagine your best hopes come true overnight tomorrow. What is the very first thing you'll notice? And what will your partner notice? And how would you respond? How would they respond? And that kind of comes from Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein's idea of language games. And Wittgenstein also was a geographer, not a historian, and Deleuze and Guattari are kind of geographers. So Wittgenstein is like, instead of digging down below the building to find the foundations or the geology of the building, instead walk around it and look at things differently, blink and look at things again, look at things differently over here. And so I think there's, again, part of my work is going to have to be kind of drawing these two theorists together. But I think that that's really what a use of a line of flight would do, is to pay attention to the resources you already have, because we know when we're with a partner, if you're in a relationship or any friendship or just even if we're just talking about ourselves, we know what it's like to live without the problem for a day. So let's say we're having a shitty time with ourselves and we're feeling, so the whole idea with solution focused therapy is to pay attention to the exceptions. So if somebody is depressed for 6 days out of 7, what's happening on the 7th day? And because it's easy to only talk about line 1, so what the problem is, rather than thinking about, well, what solutions, what resources might we already have, it means that we stop paying attention to those. So really, I think that this way of thinking of, well, how else might we look at this? What else is going on here? If we were to tweak this over here, might this thing help over here? And so when I do solution-focused chats with couples, often it is a tiny thing that has changed that has meant the whole assemblage has really shifted, because everything is in relation to everything else. So the line of flight doesn't necessarily have to be this massive kind of thing, spending your savings on a night going to see strippers or something to get something out of your system, or, having an affair, or just, not coming home one night or something. It could just be, looking at your partner in the eyes in the morning and saying, good morning. Did you sleep well? Rather than grunting and giving them a cup of coffee or something. That's quite an anodyne kind of example, but it could be tiny things can offer a line of flight, is basically what I'm saying.
No, I think this is the benefit of the kind of Deleuze or Guattari, or at least post-structuralist approach you take, because it's non-binaristic, and that doesn't reintroduce a binary of saying that every line of escape is therefore kind of the morally right one. Even taking like a phrase from Deleuze and Guattari and thinking about, say, not establishing a binary between monogamy and ethical non-monogamy, or polygamy or polyamory, and saying that, well, no, because there's already a multiplicity in a monogamous relationship, and there's even a multiplicity of relations and connections in one's relationship to oneself, which we are not fully cognizant or conscious of. And it's about cultivating those new kinds of consciousness. So I think this non-binaristic thinking is a really good way of going for it, particularly insofar as, it withholds judgment to the extent that this is not the normative version. Well, of course, there are still judgments. I mean, for example, if you want to act in this way, you can say, I want to act. If you want to act in a ethical way, you can do this. You have to say, like, this is unethical. So if we want to act in an ethical way, you can do X, Y, and Z. If you want to act in an unethical way, which I will not endorse nor advise to, this, that, and that. It doesn't cut off anything in advance or to give a more sort of total analysis. And if you want to carry on this sort of non-binaristic sort of subtractive dimension, one of the concepts that you use quite a lot, especially recently, is the body without organs. And of course, this show, because we can make a clip like a Seinfeldian clip show all the time. We've tried to explain and have explained, not just tried, but also tried and failed better to explain the body without organs. But I just want to ask how this fits into, for example, how you would talk about relationships and ways in which you start to feel yourself as embodied, particularly not through this concept, you're not doing it through the concept, but the way in which this concept describes an active and immanent state of embodiment.
Yeah, I was literally reading this. I was reading out quotes from The Body Without Organs as if it was just the best self-help advice book I've ever read on one of my recent podcasts. I can't remember. The issue with my podcast is that I kind of just record them. I make bullet points, I record them, and I immediately forget what I've talked about. So I can't remember which one it was. It might have been which feelings are mine.
I think it was that one.
Yeah. So I just think that it's that somebody wrote into me afterwards and I read it out on the following episode, because at the end of the episode I said, have you felt like you've been the body without organs lately? And the guy rang in from the rival football team to me. Thankfully, we beat them, so that was good twice this season. So that's important to me. But he was saying when he went to the football, he really felt like the body without organs. He felt like he was affecting the players as much as the players affecting him, and that everyone was this kind of singing machine, I suppose, and they were a desiring machine themselves. And he felt completely, and his sense of himself was just subsumed into this what Deleuze and Guattari would call the body without organs. And it's kind of one of those things where it's easier to feel and to remember than it is to explain. And that's what Deleuze and Guattari, that's how they open the plateau, which I think is great. And they're like, well, you probably already have one, Mike, which is a great way to kind of open a plateau. Here's what it is. Well, we're not going to tell you. You probably already had one, so you tell us, kind of thing. And I suppose it's that there are always these possibilities for us to experience the body without organs, where I think probably it's as well as feeling embodied, it's feeling like really kind of alive. It's feeling really emergent and full of possibilities, and just to be experiencing that kind of Spinozan joy of just being full of capacity to affect others and for others to affect you. I think that's kind of like how I kind of describe it. And I think that the way I bring it in is in my work is a way of helping people to kind of draw a line of flight, to think about how they think, for example, about their body. Is their body with organs, or how the body is often trapped through like discourse, and how the body is how we're made to feel shit about our bodies, for example, or how made to feel that our bodies need to be productive or unproductive, or how we should be treating our bodies as kind of inhuman kind of machines that can be switched on or off for various things, and that we're taught to completely disavow anything that affects us in any way, and in order to just get stuff done, I suppose. I think the sex and relationships is the possibility where it's the possibility of where we might see ourselves as the body without organs, in order that we can see how that might have a micropolitical effect, where if we feel on a Saturday afternoon watching a football team who aren't even very good, but we're feeling the body without organs and feeling this collective joy, what are the possibilities of what that might do? And so, yeah, I think that's how I bring it in. But also, I suppose the other thing I just might be useful to say about this as well is that when it comes to sex, and this is partly to do with capital, but it's also partly to do with bad sex ed and normativity, is that there are so many kind of discourses about the body and how the body should work. So, for example, orgasms, that we become so extracted from our bodies that we don't know what it is that we're supposed to be feeling. So I answered a question from a young woman the other day over at BISH who said, I can orgasm, but I can't come. I'm like, okay, well, around 40% of women experience some expulsion from the vagina, which they say happens when they're experiencing an orgasm, but like 60% of women kind of can't. And really how so? And then I went on later on to explain, well, we've become this kind of cum-centric kind of society where the jizz is the thing. Like, it's very Oedipal, isn't it? The jizz is the thing. And so everyone has to jizz now. Otherwise, it's not real. Otherwise, it's not actually happened. We can't present evidence of it happening. And so we're having to present evidence of an orgasm rather than experiencing it and what it feels like when our core is so activated that an orgasm is like thrusting out of our middles, and that our vagus tone is doing things we didn't think possible, and that our brain activity is giving us an out-of-body experience. Those things don't count. It's that you have some fluid coming from your genitals. That's the docile body that we're basically having to kind of to fight against. And so I think when we're opening up the avenues for people to understand, well, actually, you could experience in your body in this entirely different way, and also drawing on some examples of this. So, we've all experienced some example of my listener who went to see a football match. You know, if we went to a party or we were at a comedy show and we're just rolling around in laughter with everyone else, we're bodies without organs. If we see something so beautiful and it takes our breath away and we're just transfixed with that thing for a moment, with a body without organs. If we're smelling a delicious cup of coffee or just eating something that, you could be eating, I don't know, a Yorkie bar. No, don't eat a Yorkie bar. They're made by Nestle.
I have to say this, but could we say that way of thinking about orgasms, about thinking about coming, is a kind of content creation? There's definitely an overlap between this sort of like, hey, I'm going to produce essentially a commodity right now. And we've reduced sexuality to, the visibility of something that is born from us and is tangible and is, despite being evanescent in some sense too. Anyway, Adam, sorry. That was had to do it.
No, I completely agree. When you click publish, it's jizzing, isn't it? And then it's on to the next one.
And then how many times have you just gone back through your YouTube thumbnails and you're just kind of checking in? Oh, yeah, it's a nice stack there.
And like I was saying before, I do my podcast and then I instantly forget about what I've said. So, that's the most Oedipal thing that I do probably.
There was a podcast refractory period. I remember once I had to reteach myself Jean Baudrillard, which is quite ironic what it was, by listening to a podcast we did when I was doing a big diatribe on Jean Baudrillard. So I had to learn it through my own leavings. I mean, honestly, I think the content creation thing is a good way to put it. Like, one, it's a productive thing. One, it's literally a recorded thing. Like, it's recorded as an basically there's an artifact there. There is something produced. It is a recording of a certain machinic output, which therefore proves that there's an input, which therefore proves there's something, normative on the other side of it. I mean, this is a kind of a sort of thrown out there a bit, but do we think that the data economy sort of platforms, the ways in which, because Justin, you run an internet-based site, we're all sort of the new flesh here to some extent, mediating things through podcasts and data economy and content. How do you think this has really changed? I mean, of course it has, but this has changed so much our relationships to relationships, and indeed mediating them as a kind of potential content. If someone has sex in the woods and no one is there to post about it, did it happen? Right. It kind of feels a bit like we're mediating it through so much of, oh God, I'm about to use Lacan as well. So the symbolic order or the social fields or the fact that we're increasingly, as you said, discursively produced, insofar as our bodies are discursively produced more and more, and discourse overdetermines more and more things insofar as, let's talk about dating apps or things mediated through social media, which is of course a very particularly first world way of doing things. Absolutely. I mean, but regardless, how do you think this is changing? These new machinics. Let's use the term Deleuze and Guattari, like machinic enslavement. Do you think that these are really changing the way that we can relate to each other in sometimes maybe positive way, because we can reach each other across time and space, and therefore relate to each other across time and space, which is always good. But also, it's changing the ways we see ourselves, and we might see ourselves indeed as contents to be fulfilled, as brands, and it's overdetermined by them. So I was wondering, how does sort of your materialist approach tackle, and I guess this would go towards, a lot of the advice you're getting through the internet, tackle sort of relationships or, love and death in the internet age?
I guess one of the things I was thinking about when you were saying that was that it's to do with lack and our relationship to the thing, or the thing which has become thingified, which I believe in Thousand Plateaus they're calling a hexity. That's the first time I've ever said that word out loud, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it's what we do with the thing, isn't it? Is the Deleuze and Guattari response. And I'm really drawing on Jeremy Gilbert's explanation of this, which is incredibly useful. But just if we're thinking that we are this kind of an incomplete circle that will be filled in by this thing, then we are in some. What does that do? Well, it might help to kind of explain who we are, but it would also encourage us to draw a very arboreal kind of version of ourselves that is complete and done and finished and no longer has to kind of desire, I suppose. But if we saw it as these things as helping us do things, like what does it help us to do, then all the things that you were just talking about can be, I suppose, reterritorialized in ways which can help us to become help us draw a line of flight, but basically to, I use dating apps. I do ethical non-monogamy, which isn't a secret to anyone who listens to my podcast. And so, I use the apps. I find somebody in order not to kind of, and then that they become like a connection, which is, I suppose, a thing. But then it's like, okay, well, what does that connection do? Rather than as kind of like owning a connection or saying, this is in some ways fulfilling my kind of lacking self. It's given me these possibilities of plugging into further assemblages, I suppose. So I think it's always this kind of, I think the territorialization, deterritorialization, reterritorialization is a useful thing to think about in terms of those things in the world of sex and relationships and the current milieu that we're all in, I suppose.
Maybe this is a good time to turn to the topic of friendship, because one of the things that I'm hearing amidst what you've just said, I was thinking about parasocial relationships in particular, and how often online you even see a kind of moralizing against parasocial relationships. And I have to say, I love and very much enjoy many of the people that I've met online, like even having you in the room here, Justin, right now. Now you are part of this grand assemblage, and I don't take that for granted, even though this is a sort of transient event of sorts. I mean, I hope to talk to you in the future, but this is part of the way that I've kind of organized my life doing what it is that we do. At the same time, I think there is, and here again, here's the language of lack. I was about to say there's a kind of paucity in those relationships because I don't get the fulfillment of having the friend in real life that I had when I was 12 years old. And now this takes me to this other issue that, well, maybe around the time I was 27 or 28 years old, then began the slow decline of interactions with people whom I called friends. People were getting married, monogamous relationships, and, people just getting busier in their professional careers. And seeing how mid to late adulthood in particular, there's this kind of drop off that occurs that by the time you're 35 or even 40 years old, you're like, shit, where did all my friends go? You're lucky if you have one person that you kind of catch up with on the weekend or something like that. And my own personal experience of it was a kind of quiet lament, and maybe the growing of a sort of tacit resentment to the idea like, well, I guess this is the time when there's no friends, so be it, just kind of taking it for granted. But seriously, also thinking how tragic it was that we live in a world so overcoated by this sort of transcendent ideal of professionalism, monogamy, and everything else, that those nourishing points of contact were gone. And I did not avail myself in some way of finding new ones or making new ones. Actually, the podcast was a very good way for me to do that. And also, strangely enough, and anybody else who's done this might have the same experience, when I moved to a rural area, I have an abundance of friends now, right? The sort of alienation that I felt when living in Los Angeles has completely subsided. And now I have a friend who's 61 years old and we play electronic music together like once every 2 weeks. And now I have a few friends with whom, I'll have a beer every 2 weeks, and my wife and my friends online. And I would say I live in a very rich ecology these days. And from like a Deleuzian perspective, if you put these relationships in the right frame, well, then you can live in a very enlivened way. And I certainly feel that way. But I imagine for a lot of people out there, because there was a time where I did feel lonely and I was getting lonelier as things were going. And I'm curious to what extent you encounter that sort of dynamic in your work. I mean, there's such a focus on sex sometimes too, that we elide the importance of friendship. I'm hoping you have a couple comments about that.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about this. Thanks for teeing me up. I think that what you're saying there is, you have a very rich assemblage or set of assemblages, which sounds, really wonderful. And you've managed to do abundant relating in times of scarcity. And that is the issue that we're all facing, is that how do we have abundant relationships in times of scarcity? So when housing costs are incredibly high, where for many of us, our work life is just so draining, it's very, very difficult to meet new people. To go back to what you're saying earlier it is that where every single aspect of our life that might be about joy can also be kind of capitalized and potentially remunerated. Our side hustles become essentially paying, for example, those material conditions make friendships really, really hard, much, much harder. COVID also had a massive effect on this as well. And I suppose the answer to the online-offline issue is, well, it can be both, but we also do have to make time for both. That if we're online, that means we're doing something that we're not doing something else. So I talk about Duchamp's door a lot on my show because I saw it once and it makes me feel fancy to talk about it. So Marcel Duchamp had a door which put in his flat in Paris, which the same door closed the bathroom door that opened the kitchen door, and that door which closed the kitchen door opened the bathroom door. So one door doing two things. So if we're online, it means that we're not doing some things offline. And so we might be missing out on more kind of haptic relationships, but that doesn't make the less kind of in-person touching relationships, any potentially touching relationships, or being, near people effectively in person doesn't make them any less significant. It's just that we need some of all of it. And so I think another way of thinking about abundant relationships is to think about the different words that ancient Greeks had for love. So philia, pragma, agape, philautia, storge, ludus, pragma. I always feel like I forget one. But, all of those different kinds of love, which involve pets, trees, or bushes. Bushes, hops, grass, not trees, boo to trees. People, family, friends, different kinds of playful relationships, serious supporting relationships, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with, teachers, organizations, community, all this kind of stuff. I think one of the issues, and one of the things that I've written a long blog post about this at BISH recently called How to Make Friends. If you Google BISH, How to Make Friends, you'll find it, dear listener. On there, I've said, look, I've said at the beginning, these are the reasons why finding friends is hard at the moment, right? But I'm only going to spend 2 paragraphs on that because you don't need to know this. Like, you already know why it's hard. There might be some other things that you haven't thought of, but also sometimes it isn't you. There's only so much control you can have over these things. But I'm not going to help you if I keep going on about the problem all the time. So if somebody wrote into me saying, or wrote to my podcast saying, Justin, I don't have any friends, and if I spent 50 minutes of the podcast saying, well, this is the reason you don't have any friends, it's really hard, and then just gave them 10 minutes at the end saying, well, you could maybe join something, get a hobby, which is what a lot of people do, particularly on the left. That is the kind of response quite often, because we have to reify the left, our leftist talking points all the time, and I am part of the left. But instead, on this article that I've got a set of resources. It's like, okay, well, who do you know already? And if let's say how close are you to each of the people in your life? How close are you on a scale of 10, incredibly close, to 0, the opposite? Where are you on that scale? How would it be different? How would it feel? What would you notice was different if you were able to get that number up 1 for each friend? So if for each friend you went from like a 4 to a 5, or a 6 to a 7, or a 3 to a 4, then you might start to discover you already have the potential for some other friendships, or closer friendships, or more intimacy, or different kinds of relationships with the people you already have. Or, okay, pick 20 things you like. If you can get to 20, pick 50 things you like. With each of those different things, think about the time when you liked it the most. What were you thinking about it? What were you saying? How were you responding to that thing? How else might other people have responded to that? What might they have said about this? In order to get them to think, well, in this materialist way, in this kind of, an atomist way, that we're all made out of the same stuff, that if there's a tree you really like, okay, let's say we like trees again. Let's say there's a tree you really like and you walk past it every day. 100 other people walk past that tree, have the same feelings as you. Why can't that tree become the basis for you becoming friends with some of those people? Even if that friendship is just literally noticing that person saying, hey, beautiful tree, isn't it? That's something. That micro moment of positivity resonance, as Barbara Friedrichsen calls it, is an example of what it feels like to be in love with someone. So, our neural pathways map onto the other person that we're experiencing this moment with. Our pupils dilate to take in more of the other person. Oxytocin kicks in to help us to tune into them. So oxytocin isn't the love hormone, it is the tuning in hormone. So we feel at one with that person, which allows our vagus tone to kick in, which regulates our heartbeat and our breathing, which helps us to be in that moment for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Bang, you're in love. Okay. Now, if you can get used to that feeling and get used to that feels nice, and all it required was for me to take my headphones off, to look around and to pay attention and to really fall in love with this tree and to notice what other people might be feeling like if they're falling in love with that tree, then that's the beginning of something. And if we do that in every single aspect of our lives, we're much more likely to find friends. We're putting ourselves in a position where we are increasing our capacity to meet other people and for other connections to happen. And again, it's this idea of, well, this one little thing, because it's in relation to everything else, which is also in relation to everything else, has the possibility of changing everything. So I also frame it as, you already have friends, you just haven't met them yet. They're kind of out there. And then that takes us away from this kind of, from fully thinking that, this takes us away from this kind of lack where we, I don't have friends for these reasons, and there must be these things about me that are unlikable. I'll never make friends. And instead of that, by asking kind of what else and what do you notice and what might they notice and what difference would it make, asking those kinds of lines of flight questions to ourselves, it helps us to understand we don't know ourselves at all. Right? And actually having this kind of self-knowledge, certainly through our problems, the kind of what I was saying before, the line one knowledge, isn't sufficient knowledge, and it's not actual self-knowledge, and it's certainly not a becoming knowledge. We can only be becoming if we are drawing lines of flight around our first two lines, to go back to what I was saying earlier. And so there are these possibilities for making friends, but all of that is still existing, within the broader materialist analysis of why it's harder to make friends because we have less time. But what are the possibilities for this micro-politically? So if it ends up that you join a renters union, or you go on a demonstration, you have micro moments of positivity resonance there, and then suddenly you're playing, table tennis with them on Wednesday nights, and it turns out you're really into board games, or they know someone who might like to go dancing with, or something. It's like that. There are all these political possibilities for this as well, I think.
No, one of the things I really appreciate about your approach to this is how it breaks down this, very individualistic, heroic ego. I mean, thinking about one of the things you said in your episode about how to get a girlfriend / boyfriend / dem friend is, as you said, you start with like 10 minutes off. It's really hard. We have less time. We're more atomized. Then the rest of it is about, at least as I get it, being both interested and interesting, and putting yourself in spaces where you can make connections. And it really does sort of try to short circuit this instant gratification, the idea that I have to get a girlfriend, if you take that heavily loaded phrase, for example, getting, because incredibly loaded, and then of course making that content for your own social recognition, saying like, I am lovable, which basically says I am lovable, I am fuckable, I am relatable, etc., etc. And it's break it down to those micro processes, which I think is so important in your approach to this. Indeed, in any relations beyond even friendship, is because we require so much of the problem is in terms of we can communicate our sort of status or our line one appearances at the speed of desire at this point. But of course, desire is far more, I guess, like machinic, but multiplicitous. We don't know what we want, which is why I think when you use some sort of psychoanalytic bases, you use them for problems less than solutions. I know we're coming out to the hour at this point, but we've already mentioned that a few times. But I mean, if you've got any projects going at the moment, of course, we're going to put all of the things and the BISH, the podcast, the books, all down below. But just in case we've missed anything, where can people find you?
I did too many things. So an overview of everything I do, you can find at justinhancock.co.uk. I do solution-focused coaching through that as well. But yeah, there's BISH, the podcast, my work for anyone if you want a training course doing on how to do relationships and sexuality education, you can hit me up for that as well. But yeah, and you can find my other writing, my other appearances elsewhere at justinhancock.co.uk. Yeah.
Beautiful. We will catch you later. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.